Brodes Media.
What is going on, everybody? If you are hearing this clip before the show starts, that means I'm on vacation. What I did prior to leaving is I recorded a bunch of interviews with fantastic guests, so you still had something to consume here on Brodes Media until I return. So if any news drop that's so massive and it's not incorporated into these conversations, I apologize. There's nothing I can do about it. But I wanted to at least give you something while I was away. I love you all. You're all fantastic. Subscribe if you're new. I love you. Enjoy the shows. What is going on, everybody? Welcome on into Schmoozed. I have the Snow the Goalie crew minus Bundy, and we're going to shoot the shit about the Flyers because that's what we do. What's up, fellas?
How you doing, Brodes? Happy to be here.
I was going to open up saying that this is the only Flyers pod and all, but I decided I'd go in a different direction. I didn't want to push any wrong buttons.
Who says that? I don't know. Who is that? Somebody said.
You'd have to be a real narcissist to start off your show by calling it the Only Flyers podcast.
Who would do
That's right.
You know? Who would do such a thing?
Yeah,
Certainly not us.
I know. We're going to jump right into things here, and I'm just going to say I'm pumped for the start of Danny Briere and Keith Jones. I saw some savviness in the Provorov deal. I love not having to trade up for Mishkov, getting rid of Kevin Hayes, you name it. I love it all. Go ahead. Floor is yours. Whoever wants to go first.
Go ahead, Russell.
Oh, thanks so much, Ant. I appreciate it. You know, listen, it's hard to be negative about them right now. There are people who will try. There are people on social media right now who are incensed that the Flyers essentially gave away whatever was left of Kevin Hayes and gave away whatever was left of Tony DeAngelo. And there are people who want John Tortorella fired. There are people who, want to see, blood in the streets. I'm not one of those people. I traditionally have been one of those people who sat back and said, this is not good. This is on the wrong track. We're being gaslighted by the GM, etc. But when a new regime comes in from the CEO of Comcast Spectacor and the governor of the team, when you start there, the president, the GM is new. Sure, the coach is the same. But when you do that kind of an overhaul, you have to give those people time. And I'm more than willing to give anyone a fair shake in this city. It certainly cannot be worse than what Chuck Fletcher was. And if somehow it does, if somehow we're sitting here in 2 years and we go, oh my God, this somehow is worse, I will come back. Bring me back on the show. Yep. I will eat a hockey stick live on the air. All right. Wow. There's just no chance. So you have to feel some kind of optimism about the team. And I'll tell you what, bro, and I'm sure you've seen this too. There are people right now who look at what's happening with the Flyers and the fact that they're being honest about a rebuild and just drafted a potential superstar, Mishkov. And they're looking at what's happening with the melodramatic Philadelphia 76ers. And they're starting to go, I don't know, man, like getting some cheap Flyers tickets on the secondary market sure seems like a better investment than going down and, hoping that Joel looks like he's in shape or that James Harden doesn't show up looking like the Michelin Man. I don't know. That's what I'm seeing.
All right. I love it. And?
Yeah. I mean, Russ pretty much said it the right way. And the thing of it is that this is being done in a way that no Flyers leadership has ever handled this organization before, ever. Okay. The Flyers have been bad in the past, but they've never done this. Okay. And they have to do it this way because of the salary cap. They've got to blow out bad contracts. So if you're not, even if you don't get anything in return for these guys, which they really didn't for Hayes and DeAngelo, certainly you can look at them in a vacuum and say, oh my God, you give up the 52-point player in Kevin Hayes and he should get more than a 6th-round pick next year. Or, oh my God, you gave up all those 3 draft picks for Tony DeAngelo and then you end up buying him out. And why would you do that? Certainly, if you look at it in a vacuum, yeah, fine. You can be a little bit more upset. I could see that. But in the grand scheme of things, when you're building a team from the ground up, and that's where they are, these are the right moves. You got to get out from under bad contracts first. So that's what Danny Briere and Keith Jones and their staff has decided to do, and I actually think it was kind of a savvy move what they ended up doing with DeAngelo, and one that I had not considered. In all fairness, I had not considered prior to it happening, because they originally thought they were going to move Sanheim in the trade with St. Louis, right? That was all part of the thing, and then Torrey Krug refuses to waive his no trade clause, and then the deal with St. Louis ends up becoming much smaller, right? So when they were thinking that deal was going to be bigger, D'Angelo going to Carolina made more sense because they were now getting rid of 3 contracts that they did not want.
Right.
So they didn't mind having 2 of their retention slots being used up for this year. The fact that they had to keep Sanheim's contract and keep that money on the books, it makes more sense to not have to retain salary on Tony D'Angelo and in turn get a long shot prospect in Rizzo to maintain that extra retention slot so that come the trade deadline, if they want to move on from 2 contracts or be a team that can facilitate some money from another team as part of like a 3-way deal and get some value out of the retention slot, that is far more valuable than the long shot prospect. And so when you look at it, that's why it makes sense. $1.6 million on the salary cap next year is nothing. It's nothing for this team. So what? You carry an extra $1.6 million on D'Angelo by buying him out. You're going to be able to do so much more. You have so much more flexibility in March when the trade deadline rolls around than you would have if you traded him to Carolina and retained 50% of that salary. So yes, everything Russ said, plus there's some nuance to what Danny's doing, and it's making a lot of sense.
Yeah, I love it, man. I love it. We're just going from someone like Chuck Fletcher, who couldn't trade JVR because he can't read the market, to someone who is understanding that we can move up in the second round of this year's draft because we're not signing Jay O'Brien and we're getting a pick elsewhere. I don't know how you guys feel about Howie Roseman, but that smells a little Howie Roseman-esque if you're telling me. But I love it, man. I'm stoked, and I'm just excited to finally watch something that I care about that has a vision, and whether they stink or not, which they're going to stink, I'm juiced up thinking about Owen Tippett. I'm a psychopath. Like, I'm excited to watch him score. I don't know. Can he get to 30 goals? Is that crazy? Am I crazy, man?
Somebody's got to score for this team, right?
Okay.
Good point.
I mean, somebody's got to score.
Somebody's got to score.
And, he's obviously going to be a big part of the power play. So, I mean, I think he can get to 30 goals, especially with the league having such an uptick in offense. So I think 30 goals is certainly reasonable.
Okay.
So that's, and fans should be excited by that. I mean, all of a sudden you got a guy, because ultimately, Brodes, if we're looking at this going forward, right, and you're trying to piece together when the Flyers are going to be competitive 3-4 years from now, is Owen Tippett a top line guy? Probably not. He's probably your second line right wing. And if that's the case and you're getting a 30-goal scorer on your second line, well, that's pretty damn good.
I got to ask this the other day. Is there anyone on this roster now that's a top D pairing or a top forward line? And my answer to that was no, and that's even including Konechny. As much as he's a great player, I could see him being a second line wing.
Yeah, the only guy I could say that is a maybe, and it will really depend on what he looks like when he comes back, is Couturier.
I guess my bar is super low. Where are you on this, Russ, on the Couturier front?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Well,
Because
it depends.
it's not now, because I don't think that as a championship winning team in this league right now that Sean Couturier fits the mold of what a championship number 1 center looks like. Is he an excellent player? Yeah. Would I rather have him as the 2C if I were building a Stanley Cup contending team? Absolutely. So he might be the closest thing you have, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to try to make the case for it. And by the way, the back injury is it's so hard to try to project out what does a healthy Sean Couturier look like? I mean, it's not going to be 23-year-old Sean Couturier. Are we talking about a guy that's 85% of what we're used to? If he gets back to that, all right, maybe he can make a case. Maybe.
Well, that's what I said. If he's healthy, because you make a comparison with Patrice Bergeron, a first-line center for Boston this year. He was Anze Kopitar, a first-line center for the Kings this year. He was. These are players that play the same style of game that Sean Couturier plays, and they were first-line centers on good teams. So, yes, he can be, but again, there is that caveat. He has to get back healthy. If he comes back and he, like you said, Russ, he's only 85%, then you're right. Then he's not a top-line center. But can he be? That's why I said the only one I would say maybe on is Couturier. If he's 100%, if he's what we expect, what we saw Couturier before the injury, then yeah, he's still a first-line caliber guy.
Okay, here's a question. If this team is, or when they turn it around, is Noah Cates your 2C?
Could be.
I'm all in. Oh,
There's
he's
no
got the
camera.
Elgato problem
This
again.
thing happens. You know what? I'm turning off my camera. You know, like what? I don't even know what this is, man.
I love it.
Like this has become like a new thing with this freaking camera. I don't get it. I freeze. It's great.
Yeah, it's all right. We'll keep mucking along. But, man, I'll tell you what. It's not sexy, but the 200-foot game, I'm all in on Noah Cates. I don't think there's a more perfect coach than John Tortorella to drill into his head how to play, and I think there's actually something blossoming there. I think he could be a 2C whenever they actually get good.
Yeah, it could be. But I think ideally he's your 3C on a team that has 3 legitimate lines.
Is Cutter Gauthier going to be a C in the NHL, or is he going to get kicked to the half wall?
Part of me thinks that he may actually end up on the wing, but they want to try him at center. They do. They're not going to just like bail on it. But if they were really confident in him as a center, I think they probably could have convinced him to leave school after last year. And the fact that they didn't push that envelope and said, go ahead, go back to school for another year, is because they think they wanted to play another year at center in college and wait and see. If he progresses this year in his second year, then yeah, maybe he can be a center in the NHL. But if he doesn't progress this year, in as far as doing the things you have to do, don't look at counting stats, but like looking at the way he plays.
Sure.
If he doesn't progress this year in that center role, then I think ultimately he gets bumped back to the outside. But that's not the worst thing in the world. It's not. I mean, you can have him on one wing and you can have Mishkov on the other and be good. Like you could be a really good team and have a really great first line.
I want winners. I want killers. I want people who fit the mold. And if they're already not sure about it, then I'm pretty sure that I'm sure it's not going to happen.
Uh-oh.
They can experiment with it. But like the one thing that you can't allow Cutter Gauthier to be is the Morgan Frost problem. And the Morgan Frost problem for a long time was he saw himself as a center. The team was convinced he was a center. Multiple coaches would not bring him up unless it was to play center. And I think it adversely impacted his ability or what his ceiling at the NHL level can be. He's still young and like he, I think, is forever going to be the guy that, you know, even for the next 3 or 4 years, people are going to look at and say, yeah, but just think about the potential. You know, like a few years ago, we're sitting on press row and Bill Meltzer, who I think everybody respects pretty well, Bill looked at me one day and he was like, yeah, you know, if Morgan Frost does what he can do and if he continues to develop, he's like, I haven't seen a Flyers prospect with vision like this since Claude Giroux. Now, if you look at that and you say, all right, well, that was 3 years ago. Where is he now? Does he look like he's on track for that? No. But like maybe he is a serviceable player, but does Morgan Frost bring you value as a wing? You know, so if you don't train these guys to be versatile players and they don't necessarily fit with what the current roster is, and you can't put them into an advantageous position, then you've essentially pigeonholed yourself. So if they don't think that Gauthier is going to be a center and they're not 100% sold, then it would be stupid of them to just stick to this idea that all he can be is a center and he can only be like a top 6 guy. He can only be a top 2 center, because then you're going to have him rotting with the Phantoms for a few years when he could maybe be up here making an impact on the wing. That's my concern. It's a high enough pick that you can't really play that game for too long. You need to get what you can of him. And like versatility, position versatility is huge in this league. So why not?
So it's going to be interesting to see what happens at center this year, because you're going to have 3 guys that you can envision all being in that probably that similar 2C role. And who's going to play where is really going to be to me, one of the more interesting developments that comes out of camp and into the start of the season with, you know, can Couturier play again after 2 years off? Noah Cates, who we talked about, and we think his ceiling is as a 2C. And Morgan Frost as a kid who you would hope can be in your top 6, because he's really not a bottom 6 guy. Really not. Even if you go 3 good offensive lines, I still don't like that, because he's ultimately going to be matched up on a third line, likely against a better line on most nights. And I still don't think he's great in his own end. So it's a real interesting dynamic to see how Torts deploys those 3 guys in what way. Of course, if Couturier can't play, then it's a no-brainer. He slides down and the other 2 guys move up. But if Couturier can play, well, then it's going to be interesting. I really think that's going to be one to watch. So,
yeah, I want to take you guys back to the draft before Mishkov, though. The second first-round pick All right. It felt to me like they drafted for need more than best available. When they went with Bonk, I thought Perot, who's a goal scorer, another forward. I know they need to replenish the back end and get some guys going here. I don't really love Cam York, to be honest. I think he's got a ceiling that's a second-line pair, which is a little disappointing considering Cole Caulfield was there, and I don't know how you guys feel about him, but I was all in. I don't know how you score 100-plus goals and go, hey, he's too small. Shove it. I wanted it. But anyway, I just feel like they went with the right-handed defenseman because they needed that, but left a little meat on the bones. Am I crazy?
We'll have to see. I mean, look, I don't watch these guys play a lot, right?
Sure.
So I've seen highlight videos. So when you see the highlight videos, you see all the good about the players, and you don't ever see what's still developing and what's missing for a player, right? So I mean, ultimately, you might be right. The rationale that they were giving quietly, they didn't really say publicly, but the rationale that they had gave quietly as to why they went York ahead of Caulfield was because they had a similar belief in Bobby Brink to Caulfield, and that they felt like, okay, let's get the better defenseman here because we think that a guy like Brink, who has very similar qualities to Caulfield, but maybe needs a little bit more time to cook before he becomes NHL ready, we could still get the same kind of player and get the defenseman that we want. York is going to be probably more of a second pair guy. I'm not certain. I know Brink had injuries. I'm not certain that he's as highly regarded by the new regime as he was the old regime. So that's why that kind of probably ends up not being the right call to draft York when they did. But at least that was their rationale. I think when you look at Bonk, they are projecting a little bit with him. And yes, you could sit there and say, well, go get another forward. But at this point, when you really look at their defensive situation, Brodes, they don't have any depth at defense. I mean, any at all. So yes, you always say draft with your first round pick, draft the best player available. And that's what they did with drafting Mishkov. But when you get to the point where it's Bonk, yes, it's still a first round pick, but it's their second first round pick. So I think that you have the luxury to maybe consider need amongst a group of players because you just need it. I mean, if you don't take Bonk there and then you take goalie, first of all, at the time, you didn't have
maybe you don't go two goalies in a row. I'm just spitballing.
Well, I'm just saying you also did not have a second round pick at the time.
You're right. You did. Yeah, you had to trade.
So
yeah.
They had to trade for that second round pick. So you don't know what you're going to get down the road. Without that second rounder, I think you have to say, okay, if we have five guys we like, we're going to take this one ahead of the other one just because this is more of a positional need.
Go ahead, Russ.
So I think that it's entirely fair for you to be concerned. But I will say that the Caulfield thing is kind of its own thing, right? Like it's understandable that you're suffering from PTCD, post-traumatic chuck disorder.
Yeah, that's a thing.
But But like realistically, I think it's okay. I don't usually like the idea of drafting for need because when you're in a rebuild, you need to get as much top end talent as you can. If they looked at their board and they said Bonk really is the best guy available for them, and it wasn't because they thought that he played a position of need, then by all means, it's worth it. Like it doesn't matter. You can look at next year's draft where a lot of the scouts are saying that the top end of next year's draft is going to be very D-man heavy. And you could look at it and say, well, maybe drafting Bonk was a stupid decision because if things go the way that you expect them to, you're going to be back in that top 5, top 10 again next year. There should be a D-man on the board. You can't go into this draft expecting that next year's draft is going to fall your way. I mean, we can play the SanFilippo hypothetical game, but like if Couturier comes back healthy, if Cam Atkinson comes back healthy, Tortorella does that thing where he raises your floor too high. There is that chance that like they end up closer to being not a real legitimate bubble team, but there is that chance that they don't end up in that bottom 7, bottom 8, which would be pretty bad. Like I think we can all agree that you're in a rebuild. You're saying you're in a rebuild. Now's the time. You're building up that equity and that understanding with your fan base. Now is the time to race to the bottom. But just in case, you can't, if you thought Bonk really is the best player on the board, you can't pass him up and say, well, you know what, we'll go get a D-man next year. Because you can't rely on that. Now, if next year's draft comes around, you get the 3rd overall pick, and at number 3, you get the top D-man in the draft, I don't think you then turn back around and say, drafting Bonk was a mistake. If anything, There's nothing wrong with getting organizational depth, because how many times under the Hextall regime were we sold, the kids are coming, these kids are going to be great, they're going to be so fantastic, they're going to be some of the best players you've ever seen, and then they come up and they're all like middle six, bottom six forwards, or they're all second pair, they're all like second pair defensemen, like maybe third pair on a good team. So that's where I land with it. I always want you to draft best available. If that's who they thought was best available, cool. If they look, if Bonk was actually their sixth best player on the board and they had 5 forwards listed above him, then it's stupid. But I don't know that. I wasn't in the room with them. So that's where I land on Bonk. I don't think ultimately it's going to matter, to be honest with you.
Yeah, as long as Mishkov comes over here and starts dominating, then we're in good shape. The question now is John Tortorella the right guy for this whole thing? Now, I actually have a good friend in Columbus, Eric Robinson, who played under Tortsy, and he loved him to death. Now, he fits that mold. He's just like a workhorse, bottom 6 guy, and that's exactly what Tortorella dreams of. So there's kind of a, I understand there's a bias involved, but he loved him. And I think while I want to lose, and I want them to lose, and I hope they lose 4-3 in good efforts. They're working hard. Let's forget about the 1 points losing in overtime. But I do think there's value in the way you show up every day, the way you prepare, the way you go about business. So I'm having a tough time with the mix. Ultimately, I think there's more pros than cons, but there's some cons there too. I don't hate it. I like it more than I don't like it, but where do you guys stand?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's why they valued a guy like Scott Lawton so much. And even though there was so much interest in him, they had a higher price tag. And it was a lot of what you just talked about, Brodes, in the sense that they want these younger players who are going to be more integral parts of the team this year to understand what it means to do things, come to work, and do it the right way. And not just on game day, but at practice, and in the weight room. And, just kind of have that leadership there for them to see. And it's even more important when you're losing games, right? That you have veteran guys who are willing to come in and just still be pros and do the job. I think that's why you went out and got free agents like Garnet Hathaway, who a lot of people say is a workhorse like that off the ice. And Mark Stahl, who's going to be a really valuable resource to these young defensemen and probably going to get you a draft pick at the deadline, right? I mean, that's a really smart under the radar signing, right? And so there's a lot of benefits to things like that. So yeah, the team can still stink record wise, but I'm pretty confident that they're going to have improvement as far as development of young players, playing within Tortorella's system, and really building something together so that when they're good, they can lean back onto these times and say, okay, yes, this is what we did. This is how we handled it. And we are ready for this. And we are ready for any kind of adversity in the future when we're actually a pretty good team.
Ann said it very nicely. I'm going to say it a little bit more directly. Okay.
Beautiful.
And I want to preface this with Kevin Hayes went through a real tragedy with the loss of his brother. So we're going to acknowledge that. I don't know what it's like to go through something like that. I imagine that it's really difficult and it's horrible. Okay. The previous regime went and pacified Kevin Hayes by bringing in as many of his buddies as he could. Okay. He was trying to get the most out of his big signing because So they went all in on the Kevin Hayes collective. It clearly didn't work. None of it worked. None of it was a rousing success. The first thing that Danny Briere did, I mean, other than jettisoning Ivan Provorov, who was not popular in that locker room, was figuring out how the hell do we get rid of Kevin Hayes, was not bringing back Kevin Hayes' pals. So once you got that out, that is very indicative. And I think what it should tell people is, even if you're not walking in that locker room after games and you're not having these chats and you're not talking to people in the organization, this regime made it very clear from the get-go that whatever quote unquote leadership they thought Kevin Hayes brought to the table, or whatever the previous regime thought his leadership looked like, did not fly with this group, did not fly with John Tortorella, who benched him multiple times last year, publicly called him out. And it certainly didn't jive with whatever Keith Jones and Danny Briere believed is leadership. So that should tell you everything you need to know. I go back to an interview that we did during the season with Owen Tippett. Tippett talked about how nice it was to have a coach who's direct and who pushes you, lights a fire under you. If for no other reason than Tortorella is like the culture builder, do I think he's going to be the guy who's going to lead this team to a championship in like 3 or 4 years? No. But if you're going culture and you want to figure out which of your prospects have the testicular fortitude to get the job done, he's going to find them. For better or worse, is he going to alienate players who don't play like that, like a Travis Sanheim who plays soft in the corners? Yeah, he probably will. Is it going to make it harder to potentially move Sanheim down the line? Yeah, that no trade clause also doesn't help. But I do think he's going to find the guys that you can build as a championship core, the guys who are kind of along the lines of what you're looking for from a Scott Lawton in that leadership vein. And then by the time you're ready to contend, you fortify it with star players and you do take that next step and try to contend.
Beautiful. I love it, fellas. I had a great time. What's up, man? You got something
I
to
got
say?
one little thing for you, just real fast. I don't know if you guys saw it. It was
Is that a little nugget? You dropping a nugget at the end here?
Not really a nugget, but it's this thing that people might like to hear. There was an interview done in allhockey.ru, so it's a Russian hockey magazine, and it was an interview with Donat Stalnov, who is a teammate of Matvei Mishkov, and he was asked about all the negativity that is out there about his personality and everything else. I just want to read his quote that was used in this story. Today, it has become fashionable for various kinds of journalists to throw negative things at Mishkov's address. Usually this is done using the same technology. I was told that someone heard from someone who once crossed paths with Matvei. At the same time, those people who are really close to Mishkov are far from such odious interpretations. That's the English translation of what he said in Russian. In other words, don't believe what you're hearing about him as a teammate. He's actually a pretty good teammate. So
I love it. I can't
wait. With that said,
yeah. No, I can't wait. Now, you guys can plug Snow the goalie here, all the stuff.
I'll let Russ do it because I actually have to run.
Absolutely. Go ahead. So, Russ, you can do that.
Mr. Important over there.
Yeah, I know, for real. I'll put all the info down below. You know how it works.
Snow the Goalie, it's just a little Flyers podcast. We just hit number 4 in the US for Apple Podcasts, hockey podcasts. It's no big deal. No big deal, guys. We're not a big deal. Don't worry about us. No, but we're available wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, soon rest in peace, Stitcher, Pandora, Amazon Music. And
is that going away, Stitcher?
Yeah, Stitcher's going away. It's funny because if you listen on Spotify, they run ads every so often where they're like, if you're listening to the show on Stitcher, it's going away. Rest in peace, Stitcher. Subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. And I'm like, all right. Wow. I guess they're not doing anything with Stitcher. Okay. But we're on all those platforms. We've got the YouTube channel. You can go, and I'm starting to put up old archived episodes because what I've learned, and I'm sure you've learned this too, people really like to go back and listen to old takes. And they like to go back and they like to listen to like, what did these jamokes say about the Philadelphia Flyers 3 years ago, 5 years ago? So I'm going back and putting all those episodes up. It's a fun little side thing that we do there. But we're on all the social platforms. You can find us, find Ant, and find me, and all that, and find Bundy. And it's a great time. We have fun. I like to think that we have fun on our show.
Yeah, no, you guys are kicking ass, man. I appreciate the time. Thanks for joining.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us on.